e4, king's pawn opening, opening line. The king's pawn opening move is both popular and logical. It controls the center, opens lines for both the queen and the bishop, and usually leads to an open game in which tactics, rather than slow maneuvering, predominates. d6, Pirt's defense, opening line. The Pirt's defense is analogous to the king's Indian against a queen-pawn opening. d6 prevents an immediate e5, while black goes about fianchettoing the king's bishop. d4, Pirt's defense, opening line. The normal reaction to the Pirt's defense, 2d4, secures the center and allows for a variety of developing systems. Knight f6, Pirt's defense, opening line. This is one of few defenses to 1e4 which allows black a closed position, not venturing to play an open position with its tactical flavor. Grandmaster Yasser Serouan and International Master Mark Leski use it a considerable amount of the time. Knight c3, Pirt's defense, opening line. e5, Pirt's defense, opening line. Knight f3, Pirt's defense, opening line. Knight b d7, Philidor's defense, Nimzovich or Jaenisch variation, improved Hanham variation, opening line. Bishop c4, Philidor's defense, Nimzovich or Jaenisch variation, improved Hanham variation, opening line. Bishop e7, Philidor's defense, Nimzovich or Jaenisch variation, improved Hanham variation, opening line. Castle kingside, Philidor's defense, Nimzovich or Jaenisch variation, improved Hanham variation, opening line. Castle kingside, Philidor's defense, Nimzovich or Jaenisch variation, improved Hanham variation, opening line. a4, out of opening book, Queen e2, would have been in the Philidor's defense, Nimzovich or Jaenisch variation, improved Hanham variation, book opening. c6. Rook e1. a5. h3. Knight b6. Attacks White's bishop at c4. Bishop f1. Moves it to safety. E takes d4. Attacks White's knight at c3. Queen takes d4. Protects White's knight at c3. White wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. d5. Bishop g5. h6. Attacks White's bishop at g5. Bishop h4. Moves it to safety. D takes e4. Threatens White's knight at f3. Knight takes e4. Protects White's knight at f3. Queen takes d4. Attacks White's pawn at b2. Knight takes d4. Protects White's pawn at b2. Knight b d5. Frees Black's knight at f6 from the pin. Knight takes f6 check. Checks Black's king and blocks Black's pawn at f7. Bishop takes f6. Removes the threat on Black's king and forks White's bishop at h4 and White's knight at d4. Bishop takes f6. Removes the threat on White's knight and blocks Black's pawn at f7. Knight takes f6. Black wins a queen, a bishop, a knight, and a pawn. 4. A queen, a bishop, a knight, and a pawn. Material is even. Bishop c4. Rook d8 threatens white's knight. c3 protects white's knight. King f8. Rook e5. Bishop d7. Rook a e1. Rook e8 partially pins white's rook at e5. f4. b6. King f2 frees white's rook at e5 from the pin. Rook a d8. Knight f3. c5 attacks white's pawn at a4. Bishop b3 protects white's pawn at a4. Bishop c6. Rook takes e8 check, forks black's king and black's rook at d8. Bishop takes e8, protects black's rook and black's king. Black wins a rook for a rook. Material is even. Rook e2. b5. A takes b5, creates a passed pawn on b5 and isolates black's pawn at a5 and black's pawn at c5. Bishop takes b5, attacks white's rook. Black wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. Rook e5. Moves it to safety, pins black's pawn at c5, and attacks black's pawn at c5. Bishop c6. Frees the pin on black's pawn at c5. Bishop c4. Blocks black's pawn at c5. a4. Rook e2. Knight e4 check, checks white's king. King e3 moves it out of check. Knight d6 attacks white's bishop. Bishop d3 moves it to safety. Rook e8 check, checks white's king. King f2 moves it out of check. Rook takes e2 check, forks white's king and white's pawn at b2. King takes e2, removes the threat on white's pawn at b2. White wins a rook for a rook. Material is even. f6. g3. King e7. Knight h4. g5 threatens white's knight. Knight f5 check, moves it out of harm's way, forks black's pawn at h6 and black's king and blocks black's pawn at f6. Knight takes f5, protects black's king and black's pawn at h6, attacks white's pawn at g3 and blocks white's pawn at f4. Bishop takes f5. Removes the threat on white's pawn at g3 and blocks black's pawn at f6. G takes f4. Attacks white's pawn at g3. G takes f4. White wins a knight and a pawn for a knight and a pawn. Material is even. King d6. King e3. Bishop e8. Bishop e4. Bishop d7. Attacks white's pawn at h3. h4. Moves it to safety. Bishop e8. Bishop b1. Bishop c6. King d3. Bishop b5. Check. Checks white's king. King e4. Moves it out of check. Bishop d7. Bishop a2. Bishop c8. Bishop f7. Bishop d7. Bishop c4. Blocks black's pawn at c5. King c6. Bishop e2. King d6. Bishop d1. f5. Check. Checks white's king. King d3. Moves it out of check. Bishop b5. Check. Checks white's king. King c2. Moves it out of check. Bishop c4. Blocks white's pawn at c3. King d2. Attacks black's pawn at a4. Bishop b5. Protects black's pawn at a4. King c1. King d5. Bishop c2. Threatens black's pawn at f5. Bishop d7. Removes the threat on black's pawn at f5. King b1. King c4. Blocks white's pawn at c3. King a2. King b5. King a3. Blocks black's pawn at a4. King a5. Bishop d1. Bishop b5. Bishop f3. Bishop d7. Bishop h5. Blocks black's pawn at h6. Bishop c6. Bishop e2. Bishop b5. Attacks white's bishop. Bishop f3. Moves it to safety. Bishop d7. Bishop d5. King b5. Bishop f7. King a5. Bishop c4. Blocks black's pawn at c5. Bishop c8. Bishop e2. Bishop d7. Bishop d3. Bishop e6. Bishop e2. Bishop d7. Bishop f3. Bishop b5. Bishop d5. Bishop d7. Bishop a2. Bishop c8. Bishop b1. Bishop e6. Bishop c2. Bishop d7. h5. Bishop e8. Slightly better is c4. Evaluating. The chessmaster recommends pawn to c4. You move your pawn to c4. White responds by moving the king to a2. You move your king to b6. White replies by moving the king to b1. You move your king to c5. White counters with the king to c1. You move your king to d5. White counters by moving the king to d2. You move your bishop to e6. White responds by moving the king to e2. You move your bishop to d7, which protects your pawn at a4. White counters with king to f3. You move your king to e6. White counters by moving the king to e3. You move your king to d5. White replies by moving king to e2. You move your bishop to e8, which attacks White's pawn at h5. White counters with bishop takes pawn at f5, which creates a passed pawn on f4. Your bishop captures pawn, which checks White's king and creates a passed pawn on h6. White responds by moving king to e3, which moves it out of check. As a result of this line of play, you win a pawn for a pawn. In addition, the development of your pawns is somewhat improved. Also, the pressure on White's king is slightly increased. Bishop e8. Slightly better is c4. Bishop takes f5. Creates a passed pawn on f4. Bishop takes h5. Creates a passed pawn on h6. Black wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. Bishop h7. King b6. f5. Pushes the passed pawn. King c7. King takes a4. White wins a pawn. White is up a pawn. King d6. Bishop g6. Attacks Black's bishop. Bishop f3. Moves it to safety. f6. Advances the passed pawn. h5. Advances the passed pawn. King b5. h4 advances the passed pawn. Bishop f5. Bishop g2. f7 adds a promote threat at f7. King e7 attacks White's pawn at f7. King takes c5 creates passed pawns on c3 and b2. h3 advances the passed pawn. Bishop takes h3 threatens Black's bishop. Bishop takes h3. c4 pushes the passed pawn. King takes f7 removes the promote threat at f7. Black wins a bishop and a pawn for 2 pawns. King d6. King e8. King c7. Bishop g2. b4 pushes the passed pawn. Bishop f1 attacks White's pawn at c4. c5 moves it to safety and advances the passed pawn. Bishop b5 look out leads to c6. King e7. King b6. Bishop c4. c7. Bishop e6. King b7. King d6. b5. King c5. b6. King b5. King a7. King c6. b7. King takes c7. b8. Queen check. King c6. Queen b6. Check. King d5. Queen b3. Check. King d6. Queen c3. King e7. King b6. Much better is King e7, leading to King b6, Bishop g2, b5, King e6, King a5, King d5, King b4, Bishop e4, b6, King c6, b7, King takes b7, c6, check, Bishop takes c6, which gains a queen. This was Black's only significant error of the game, but it was costly. Black was never able to regain the lost ground, and eventually resigned. c6 pushes the passed pawn. Bishop a4 leads to King b7, Bishop b3, c7, Bishop d5, check, King b8, King e7, c8, Queen, King f6, Queen d8, check, King e5, King c7, Bishop e4, Queen d6, check, King f5, b5, King g4, Queen d4, King f4, Queen takes e4, check, King takes e4, b6, King d5, b7, King e5, b8, Queen, King f4, Queen b4, check, King e5, Queen c5, check, King e4, King d6. Better is King e7, leading to King b6, Bishop c4, c7, Bishop e6, King b7, King d6, b5, King c5, b6, King b5, King a7, King c6, b7, King takes c7, b8, Queen, check, King c6, Queen b6, check, King d5, Queen b3, check, King d6, Queen c3, King e7, King b6, which gains a bishop. King b7. King E7. C7. Adds a promote threat at C7. Bishop D7. C8, Queen. Bishop takes C8, check. Checks White's king. King takes C8. White wins a bishop. White is up a pawn. King D6. King B7. King D7. B5. Advances the passed pawn. Black resigns.